So this week, we're continuing our Gospel in Life series. We are coming near the end-ish of this series. Only got a few of the, they're kind of heavy hitters. I've been kind of putting them off on purpose because I wanted to kind of work into it. This week, we're going to talk about the gospel in pain and suffering. I have often heard it said, and I've definitely felt it in my own life, the very worst time to be taught anything on pain and suffering is when you're right in the middle of pain and suffering, because it's the hardest time to hear it. It's the hardest time to actually receive and believe those things. So if that's you today and you find yourself in the middle of a season of suffering or emptiness or pain, whatever that looks like, my prayer this whole week for you has been that even if your heart is not in a place yet to believe this and to trust in the truth of these things, that it will at least live in your mind and be there for when God does ready your heart for it. Anytime that we talk about pain and suffering, it means that there's the potential for our conversation to get heavy. And so if you do need to just take some time, get some air, go on a little walk around the building, no judgment from me. I'm not going to ask you afterwards what the deal was or anything like that. I just want you to know you have full freedom and full permission. If you need that space, take it. And if at any point during our teaching today, God puts it on your heart to share something that is that's personal, don't be wary of the video camera in the back. I edit the videos personally, and anything that is said that is personal does not make it into the videos. So do not feel any sort of lack of freedom when it comes to those things. I think that was all of my preliminary disclaimers on the front end, the warning sticker, if you will. But we can go ahead and get into the rest of the lesson now. So pain and suffering is not part of God's original design. We do not see it in the garden. It does not fall into one of those categories of which God called things good. Meaning then if it is not good, then it's at least neutral, but I would say that it's pretty easy to say it's bad. This is a bad thing or an evil thing that exists in our world. In one sense or another, pain and suffering is often tied directly to sin in one sense or another. So this could mean when you violate what God's natural order is that He's established, when He tells us to live one way and we live apart from that, there might be consequences that cause pain and suffering that come from that because you are living outside of what God has intended. That would be a sin. The general effect of sin on creation that has caused brokenness, whether that's tornadoes or hurricanes or disease or whatever that looks like, that was not part of the original creation, but when sin enters the world, there's a certain brokenness that happens to creation that's here as well that causes a lot of pain and suffering. And then there's also suffering that's tied to just plain old human evil, just people being bad to each other, hurting other human beings. And obviously a lot more types of pain and suffering that come out of that, but just a few examples of how that ties into sinfulness as well. And the bad news for today in a lesson about pain and suffering, well, hopefully this will end up being the only bad news. There is not a one-size-fits-all answer to pain and suffering in the Bible. In fact, the Bible recognizes that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to those walking through pain, which is why we see so many examples in the Bible of different types of sufferers going through different types of struggles. And I really appreciate that about the Bible, that it does give such a breadth of what the human experience is in pain, because I think that helps us be able to find kind of handholds in the midst of our own experiences. When you look at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or when you look at the story of Paul, or when you look at the story of I mean, even someone like a Tamar or like a Hagar or like these types of people throughout the Bible with totally different experiences of pain and suffering, you can find some part of someone's story that might be similar to your own, which I think is really beautiful. I think if just to riff on Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, there are many different paths that go through the valley of the shadow of death. It's not just one road that everyone walks on the same way. There's lots of roads that go through the valley of the shadow of death, but there is only one reason to fear no evil. Only one rod and staff that comforts us. And that's kind of the silver lining, that even though we all go through pain and suffering differently, there is still one God who brings comfort in the midst of that, and who protects us and who provides for us in those places. I have something fun. Well, at least it's going to be fun for me. I don't know if it's going to be fun for you guys, but I think it's very fun. There's two stories I want us to go through, the Joseph story and the Job story. There are on your tables puppets on popsicle sticks. I would like for you guys as a table to work together to retell the story of whichever set you have. I didn't look which one's yellow, which one's orange, Alyssa, do you remember?
I think Joseph is yellow. I think we have Joseph.
Yeah, if Pharaoh's in your stack, you have Joseph. So you guys are going to work together to retell the Joseph story using puppets. You'll retell it for that table. And then this table is going to retell the Job story for you guys with puppets. So I'll just give you guys the next few minutes to go through this. I put some scripture references on the page that might be helpful. If you're a little fuzzy on some of the details of the story, you can kind of glance through. You can discuss at your table. This is a team effort that we're going through. You guys are putting on our puppet play together for one another. I hope this gets to really flex your creative muscles. Really focus on the stories of suffering. So Joseph's suffering and Job's suffering is what I really want to bring out here. Well, that went better than I ever could have dreamed. So I had my doubts about the puppet show. Yeah, so like I pitched the idea to Alyssa a few days ago and talked through it, and she was like, just do it. I was like, I don't want to make all the puppets. And like within 30 seconds, she's like, I've already found them. Like, okay, let's do it. So great job. Thank you guys for indulging me. I hope that makes those stories even more memorable than they already were, and resonates with you for years to come.
That was good.
It was. Also, I love that you guys cast Mark in the role of Potiphar's wife. I thought that was a very inspired choice.
Very solid. I'm secure in my mistake.
Okay, well, that's enough fun for the pain and suffering week, okay? Calm down, you're gonna think we're not serious, okay? Okay, so you guys did a really great job, especially of tracing out the ideas of suffering in these two stories. And there's a lot of similarities that you could grab from the two as far as what feels like a certain amount of injustice done to these individuals. Joseph may have been a little bit of a brat to his brothers, but that doesn't mean that he deserved to be sold into slavery and then, thrown in jail and all of the things that come with that, forgotten in jail for several years, all those things. But, and then Job obviously had done nothing. And so it's really easy to look at these things and say, man, God really kind of left them in the lurch, put them in this bad position and didn't do anything for them. But I want to just highlight a few verses out of these passages they're parallel to each other. So there's not as much on the page as you would think. But from the Joseph story, if you look in Genesis 39:2 and then in 21, it says, the Lord was with Joseph and he became a successful man and he was in the house of the Egyptian master. After he sold into slavery, he was working in Potiphar's house. Then, after being thrown in jail, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So you can see here in both instances, the Lord was with Joseph and provides for him in one sense or another. So there's not a distance there between the two. And then in the Job story, you see that almost identical verses, which is really a cool kind of narrative structure. But it says, "And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then, after the first round of pain and suffering is inflicted upon Job, we come back around in chapter 2, where it says, "And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incite me against him to destroy him with no reason." So you see here that God is still close to Job. He is there and present and paying attention to what is going on. God has not left Job. God has not left Joseph, despite there being pain and suffering. There's a lot of different ways to look at pain and to look at suffering and the way that you endure it. I think what is an increasingly common thing in our culture today is this idea of like self-medicating or ignoring or distracting yourself, whatever that looks like for you. And while that can help push the problem down the road, I think what God shows us in Scripture is the way that and what we want God to do is we want him to just fix the problem, right? We just want him to wipe it away. But what God does here, rather than just fix the problems all the time, is he's with them in the midst of it, as a counselor, as a provider in the background. It's not, I'm going to pull you out of this suffering. It's, I'm going to walk with you through this. I'm going to be here alongside you. And I think that that's a really important mentality to have as we go through suffering as well. Because I always would rather not be suffering than be suffering. I don't think that that's a revolutionary thing to say. But what's beautiful is when you pray to God and you ask him to deliver you from this, you can take the same mentality as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and say, hey, we believe that God is going to rescue us. But even if he doesn't, we won't worship you, King Nebuchadnezzar. It's saying, I believe wholeheartedly that God can and will rescue me. And you know what? Even if I'm wrong in that, that doesn't change who God is. And it doesn't change that he's worth me worshiping and turning to and relying on for everything, even if he doesn't act the way that I want him to act. Even if he doesn't step in and rescue me the way I want to be rescued. And obviously, we know how that story ends in a fiery furnace where there's not just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in there, but there's a fourth in the fire that looks like a son of the gods, which would be Jesus or God in some form. And so that, I think, is a beautiful picture of God is with them the whole time and walks with them through the trial as well, sees them through it. Okay, so this kind of raises a question because we've looked at suffering in these instances. So what we have to deal with is if God is allowing suffering to happen in the world, if God's going to be good and he's going to allow suffering in the world, we believe God is perfectly good, he's perfectly knowledgeable, he's perfectly able, and he allows suffering in the world. That means he has to be allowing it for a purpose. Because otherwise, if there was meaningless suffering, if God is just letting people suffer for no purpose at all, that would be evil, not good. And God is good, which means all suffering has to have purpose. We see that in Joseph's story. Joseph gets the luxury of getting to see the purpose for all of this enduring of suffering. You know, you see at the end of the Joseph story, I think it's in Genesis 50, but where the brothers are really concerned that Joseph is going to kill them. And that, especially, this is after the passing of Jacob, and the brothers are worried that now that dad's gone, the brother's going to actually inflict his will upon them. But he says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And he gets to see how it was used for the saving of many lives. Not just for that of his family, although it was, and the people of God get to persist on, like we just talked about going into the book of Exodus and the Moses story and all of that, but also saved probably millions of people in Egypt at this point, because that famine was coming. This was the largest nation in the known world at this point. And God used Joseph to save them. He would not have been ever in that position if it had not been for the prior sufferings, if it had not been for such a time as this, that he could step into that role. So Joseph gets to see the purpose of that. I want you guys to discuss at your tables for a minute, what are some examples from your life of times where you did get to see God's purpose for a particular hardship that you went through? So spend some time chatting at your tables for instances where you did get to see God's purpose for a particular hardship. I was hearing bits and pieces, but for the sake of each other, just the briefest of bullet point synopsis of what was shared at your tables.
We said that we never fully are able to understand God's reasons and big pictures, but also that our suffering has allowed us to witness to other people of the goodness of God, even in the middle of our suffering.
Good. Very good. Okay.
Mark shared about the lessons he learned in his divorce.
To see his purpose, sometimes we don't know until after the fact.
Oh, absolutely.
And after the fact, I can see that what he put me through taught me for the next step in my life.
Yeah. And I think that Joseph's story parallels that, right? This was not a 5-year plan that God had him on even like when you read about the dreams that he interprets for Pharaoh. We're talking 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. So, that's 14 years right there. After 2 years in prison, after I don't even know how long serving in Potiphar's house, there's years that happen in between suffering and then when his brothers finally come and they have the whole realization moment, and Joseph gets to see the clarity of why he was in such a place. So I definitely think there's a lot to be said for what is so difficult to understand in the moment. God sometimes gives us clarity in hindsight about what he was working in the background, even if it's only in part, but not in whole. I think that's very true. And yet sometimes you get the Job treatment. And sometimes, you're stuck waiting for the punchline and it never comes. Job is never told the reason for why he suffered. We get the benefit of getting to see why. You get to see this scene with God and the heavenly council and Satan and all of this stuff, and that God is doing this for the benefit of, one, that heavenly council, to see, one, how good God is and that Job will continue to worship him. And two, for the benefit of generations of people who read the Bible after this. Because God knows he's going to put this in the Bible. God knows it's going to be recorded and be used to encourage sufferers for, millions and billions of sufferers throughout history. So he knows the purpose. Job gets the old, how very dare you ask why I would do anything, Job, and gets restored and goes back to life and is never given any sort of explanation. Sometimes that's where you find ourselves, that we just cannot make sense of what has happened. It could just be because of, maybe you're struggling to find the rationality and the reason in a particular type of suffering, whether it's some massive genocide like the Holocaust, some devastating natural disaster like Katrina, where people are not only losing their lives and loved ones, but also all of the property they've ever owned and devastates entire cities and states, whether it's some sort of traumatic infant illness, whether it's someone who gets a personality-altering head trauma, or any case of abuse or neglect. These things that are so difficult to wrap our moral brains around. How could God ever use something this heinous for a purpose, a good purpose? And God makes it very clear to Job. He does not owe us an explanation of what he's doing in the background. Joseph gets a luxury that God shows him that. It is not the standard of which we should expect. And that's a tough pill for me to swallow. This quote has been very helpful to me this week in processing it. It comes from Evelyn Underhill, theologian and author. But she says, if God were small enough to be understood, he would not be big enough to be worshiped. And I think that that's really what we see in Job especially, this idea of, I can't understand what he's doing, but I understand as much of who he is as I can. And he is perfect and worthy of my worship. Whether I understand what he's doing or not, he's perfect and he's good. Oops. Well, we'll see if it goes back. But, hey-o. The beautiful thing about the Bible and about the gospel is Job and Joseph are not the only sufferers, but there's one who is greater, which is Jesus, the perfect Job and the perfect Joseph. Turn your Bibles to Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is something that gets read a lot around this time of year, but typically it was Good Friday. This is the suffering servant or the man of sorrows, which we sang a song last week on Easter that kind of walked through a lot of the content of this. But I want you to have it in front of you kind of as I read it over us, and I want you to be looking for ways that you see that the man of sorrows suffers in this passage. So look for the ways that he suffers. Isaiah 53 says this.
Here's some information.
And it also says this. Who has believed what he has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look upon him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he's borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we've turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people, and they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. He shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sins of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. What do you see in this chapter of the ways that the man of sorrows, who is Jesus, suffers?
Just about
Bruised.
every way possible.
Yeah. What are some specifics? Bruised, great one.
He was whipped,
Yeah.
he was,
Crushed.
Crushed.
He was made mockery of, he was whipped, he had the crown of thorns thrust on his head.
Yeah.
And even that part, people don't understand just what they did. They didn't just place it on his head.
They beat it down.
They hammered that puppy down where those thorns pierced his skull. I mean, they literally tore his beard out. They just grabbed chunks and pulled his beard out. I mean, he suffered so many indignities.
And even beyond the physical. like what we see in this passage too is he was despised and rejected, not given honor or esteem.
They made fun of him.
Right.
They ridiculed him. They called
Yeah.
him every name you could think of.
Right? What else do you guys see in this passage?
Stripes.
The whipping, the stripes, absolutely.
They dishonor his body even in death.
Yeah.
Buried him in a rich man's tomb.
Yeah. Buried with the wicked, right? Yeah.
Grieve.
Yeah. He's borne our griefs, carried our sorrows.
And to be crucified,
Yeah.
the worst possible way of death known to man, even today.
Absolutely. So what we see,
You don't die from the crucifixion, you die from suffocation.
that's right. What we see in this passage is Jesus, the ultimate Job, the only truly innocent sufferer. Because Job, as much as there is no sin for which brought about the wiping out of his family and his property and all of that, Job's still a sinner. He did not live a perfect life, but Jesus did. Truly, completely innocent, and yet suffers. And we can go to him with our suffering because he's acquainted with that sorrow. He's also the ultimate Joseph, the one who suffers sacrificially, ultimately to save his people. Joseph goes through all of this suffering and it results in the salvation of his people from a famine. Jesus endures the suffering of the cross for the salvation of all of us. It's easy for us to look at the Job story and the Joseph story and even the beautiful story of Jesus on the cross and to say, but the suffering was worth it because there's happy endings at the end of all three of those. Joseph in the highest elevated status. Job gets everything restored twofold. Jesus is resurrected. But what about in our lives when we have stories that don't have the happy endings that we wanted? There's a friend of ours whose father just passed away just about 3-4 months ago. And it was a sudden and aggressive form of cancer that came in. This man was in peak health, owned a CrossFit gym for a long time, ate really well, used to be a firefighter, took care of himself. The last thing you'd expect is his body to betray him, essentially, is what happens. Tumor forms, and he crumbled underneath it. Walked through it well with dignity and all of that, but was really shocking for the family. And there was hundreds, if not thousands, of people praying for this man, that he would be healed and that God would deliver him and his family from this. And the ending was not happy. Yes, this man was a strong believer. I think it ended very happy for him. But the problem with he's in a better place is that the rest of us are not. We're in a worse place now. Not every story ends happy in life, and not every story ends happily in the Bible. There's plenty of instances where the desired outcome by the people of God is not the outcome that God gives them. You look at the David and Bathsheba story. The child dies that's conceived through that. Even though David has been repentant, even though he's confessed all of his sin and has been restored to God himself, the child still dies. And God tells him that it is a result of the sin. This pain and suffering comes through. Same thing, John the Baptist. Arrested, even things are looking favorable, like he's going to be kept alive. And then the wife of Herod holds a grudge and says, I want his head on a platter, and literally gets it. God's promise isn't to work all things out in the end. His promise is to work all things together for the good of those who are called according to his purpose. That's what it says in Romans 8:28. God defines good. We don't define good. Michael likes to tell me God owns the trademark on good. And that's what he's working it out for, the ultimate good. The power of the gospel over all other worldviews when it comes to pain and suffering is it gives us a way to walk through pain rather than just away from it, rather than just trying to avoid it or minimize it, or distract yourself from it, whatever. It gives you the tools to walk through it. It's really popular now for people to say, if you're going through something painful, to do some sort of spiritual form of meditation to clear your mind, right? To remove the distractions and the sufferings, the negative thoughts, negative energy, all that stuff, remove that. But what religion throughout the ages, and Christianity is no exception, has taught us is to lean into. Not to meditate on emptying your mind, but to meditate on your grief and suffering. The sackcloth and ashes of the Old Testament. It's a time set aside for sitting in pain and suffering, leaning into it, to ask yourself the hard questions of why do we suffer? Is God still good? What's the point of going through all of this when it hurts so bad? We have good answers to those questions that we can lean into and ask. You can even see it demonstrated by Paul in Romans 8:18 when he says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." That one day, he looks at this suffering that he's gone through, of which he has gone through much. If you read 1 Corinthians, he'll lay it out for you. He said, I've asked myself the question, I've considered it, and I know that it's nothing compared to the glory that's coming. Jesus took the ultimate sting out of pain and suffering by giving us an eternal hope. To say, no matter how bad your suffering is in this life, it will be outshone in glory. And in fact, the suffering that you go through in this life, I think is only going to heighten the joy that we feel because of the contrast. I wouldn't know joy if it wasn't for pain, because I know how good it is when I've gone through the opposite. And there's something beautiful in that.